Right. And he makes some pretty bold claims
Yeah.
right off the bat. He kind of points out all the crazy ways that
Yeah.
people are trying to solve all their problems.
Right.
I mean, everything from eating only cabbage to staring at the sun, he's got it all in there.
Yeah. It makes you wonder, like, what are we missing here?
Right.
What is it about, are we just so focused on finding the right answer that we're not seeing what the root of the problem is?
I think he proposes a very radical shift in perspective.
Yeah.
He says the root of the problem is not about finding new answers at all. It's about undoing the basis of the problem. Huh.
Which is our own negativity.
So how do we actually let go of this negativity? I mean, it almost sounds too simple, doesn't it?
Well, it starts with, I think, a very different understanding of how
Yeah.
our emotions actually work.
Okay.
And he presents this scale of emotions,
Right.
ranging from, the lowest vibrations, which are like apathy, grief,
Yeah.
all the way up to, joy, peace, enlightenment.
I'm already intrigued.
Yeah.
How does the scale then factor into letting go?
Well, he explains that these negative emotions are often linked to survival mechanisms, right? So things like repression, denial, projection, blame.
Yeah.
While those might have served us in the past, maybe when we were kids,
Right.
they can keep us trapped in these cycles of stress and unhappiness.
Oh.
And they're actually creating the very problems that we are trying to solve.
So it's not just that we're feeling bad, but that it's these negative emotions are leading to real problems in our lives. Exactly. He has this very striking anecdote about a man who, loses his passport.
Okay.
And he's looking everywhere for it.
Yeah.
And it turns out he's just consumed with grief. So much so that he can't even think straight.
Oh, wow.
And he just overlooked the obvious place where it was.
So his focus on finding the passport
Right.
blinded him from the actual root problem, which was the underlying emotion.
Exactly. And as soon as he acknowledges this grief, he lets go of it, boom, finds his passport. It was right there in front of him the whole time.
It seems like we often try to ignore or suppress negative emotions, but it sounds like that could actually be making things worse.
Right.
So how do we surrender to these emotions without resisting them?
Well, it involves allowing the feeling to come up without pushing it away.
Okay.
It's accepting that it's there and then letting it go.
But isn't that just suppressing it in another way?
Well, no, he makes the point that it's the resist that actually traps the emotion, right? It's like a pressure cooker.
Okay.
Surrender allows the emotions to dissipate naturally.
So it's almost like we're so used to like fighting these emotions that we don't even realize we can just let them go.
Yeah. There's another story about a woman who is struggling with respiratory problems.
Oh, wow.
Turns out she's carrying a lot of unprocessed grief over her mother's death.
So her actual physical health is being impacted
Exactly.
by this emotional pain.
Yeah. And by finally allowing herself to fully grieve,
Yeah.
she experienced profound healing, both emotionally and physically. Her respiratory problems cleared up.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It really highlights the mind-body connection.
Right.
So what I'm gathering so far is that letting go is not about ignoring negativity.
Right.
It's about choosing to release it.
Yes.
And it sounds like it can have some pretty powerful effects on our well-being.
Absolutely. And the book goes even deeper, explaining how letting go impacts not just emotional and physical health.
But also, our relationships, our effectiveness in life, and even spiritual growth.
That's a lot. I mean, if this is as simple as letting go of negative emotions, why aren't we all doing this?
Well, I think sometimes the simplest solutions are the hardest to accept.
It's true. We're so conditioned to think that you have to put in a lot of effort
Right.
and struggle to overcome these things.
Yeah.
So what if it's more about shifting our perspective, choosing to respond to these emotions differently?
That's exactly what he's suggesting. He doesn't say it's easy,
Right.
but he really emphasizes the simplicity of this process. It's about recognizing that we have the power to choose
Yeah.
how we respond to these emotions rather than being controlled by them.
So we talked about the problem of negativity, what
Right.
letting go actually means and how this works. But how do we actually apply this in real life?
Well, this is where it gets really fascinating. He provides all these examples
Yeah.
of how this process can be applied in different situations.
From fear of public speaking
Yeah.
to dealing with anger constructively.
I think our listeners would love to hear some examples of how this actually works.
Okay.
Let's start with fear of public speaking, because that's something I think a lot of people can relate to.
Sure.
How can letting go help with that?
He describes this man who was able to overcome his fear of public speaking by simply accepting the possibility that he might be boring.
What?
Yeah, instead of
That's the thing.
trying to fight that fear or pretend it wasn't there,
Yeah.
he just allowed himself to fully feel it. He embraced the possibility of imperfection.
So instead of saying like, what if I mess up?
Right.
He said, what if I'm boring?
Exactly.
And he was okay with that.
Yeah.
Interesting. Did it work?
It did, yeah. By surrendering to that possibility,
Yeah.
it really released the tension and the pressure surrounding the event. He was able to just be more present and authentic in his presentation.
That's so counterintuitive. We're always told to strive for excellence, to be our best.
Right.
But here, the key was accepting imperfection.
Yeah, and you see that a lot with his examples.
What about anger? How
Yeah.
can we apply letting go to handle anger constructively?
He tells the story of a man who was really furious with his boss. His boss wasn't recognizing his talent.
Yeah.
Instead of lashing out or suppressing that anger,
Okay.
he was able to use it as fuel to propel his own success.
Oh, that's interesting. So he channeled it in a positive way rather than letting it, consume him.
Yeah, he channeled that energy and frustration into starting his own business.
So he took his boss's, lack of recognition as a challenge.
Right.
It's awesome. Are there any examples of how, like, letting go can actually improve our relationships?
Yeah, absolutely. There's this story about this woman who had this deep resentment towards someone who owed her money. And she'd tried everything to get it back. Nothing worked.
Yeah.
And finally, she decides to try something different. She just chooses to forgive the debt. She views it as a gift
Oh.
and lets go of that resentment.
So she made a conscious choice to release that negative energy she was holding on to.
Exactly.
Did that change anything?
Incredibly, within days of letting go of that resentment,
Wow.
she received a check in the mail for the full amount, along with an apology for the delay.
That's wild.
Yeah.
It's like releasing the negative energy
Right?
made space for that positive resolution.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder about the connection between our internal state
Yeah.
and our external circumstances.
It's really fascinating. He also talks about sexuality.
Yeah, he describes this couple that
Yeah.
experienced a transformation in their intimacy by shifting their focus from getting to giving.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, instead of being preoccupied with their own pleasure,
Yeah.
they decided to really focus on pleasing their partner, on giving rather than receiving.
And that actually resulted in a more fulfilling experience for both of them.
Exactly. By letting go of their own ego-driven desires,
Huh?
they were able to experience a much deeper level of connection and satisfaction.
I gotta say, I'm finding all this really fascinating, but part of me is still skeptical. I mean, it all sounds a bit too good to be true. Is there any scientific basis for these ideas?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Like, is he just pulling this out of thin air?
Right, and he doesn't shy away from that at all.
Okay.
He actually delves into all of his research,
Oh.
on muscle testing, energy fields, what he calls the map of consciousness, which he uses to provide this scientific backing for these concepts.
So he's got some data
Yeah.
to back up these ideas.
And he goes even further than that, connecting these findings to things like the holographic paradigm and quantum physics,
Wow.
which, there's growing scientific interest in this connection between consciousness and reality.
So he's suggesting that our thoughts and feelings aren't just these internal things, but they actually have a measurable impact on the world around us.
Exactly.
That's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
I think we need to take a little pause here. We're going to pick up this conversation
Yeah.
in the next part of our deep dive.
So, picking up where we left off, one of the things I found really fascinating about Hawkins' work is this idea of the map of consciousness.
Yeah, you mentioned that before. Can we dig into that a little bit more? I'm curious how he actually goes about measuring these different levels of consciousness.
Well, he uses a technique called muscle testing. It's also known as applied kinesiology,
Okay.
and it's based on the idea that our bodies react differently to true and false statements.
Okay.
And this can be observed through muscle strength.
So by testing muscle responses to different statements about emotions or beliefs, he's able to kind of map out this hierarchy of consciousness.
Exactly. And what's really remarkable is that this scale aligns with, many spiritual traditions, psychological models. It's not just based on like, subjective opinions.
Yeah.
It's based on observable physiological responses.
That's really cool. It makes it a lot less like woo-woo, as we were saying earlier,
Right.
and more, something tangible that we can work with.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example of how this map of consciousness actually works?
Sure. So, imagine someone who is, holding a belief like I'm not good enough,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That belief might manifest as a weakness in a certain muscle group when tested.
Well, wow.
But as that person, works on letting go of that belief and embraces a more positive affirmation like I am worthy, the muscle strength increases, indicating a shift to a higher level of consciousness.
That's really interesting. So it's not just this theoretical concept.
Right.
It actually has real world implications for how we live our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And he really emphasizes that the goal isn't to suppress negative emotions,
Yeah.
but rather to move up the scale by consciously choosing these higher vibrational emotions.
It sounds like a real journey of growth and evolution.
Right.
What are some of the key stages or levels in this journey, according to Hawkins?
Well, he outlines several levels, starting with those lower vibrations of shame, guilt, apathy.
Right.
These states often keep us stuck in self-sabotaging patterns
Yeah.
and prevent us from reaching our full potential.
It's like being trapped in that negativity.
Yeah.
And it can be really hard to break free from that.
And that's why, understanding these lower levels is so important.
Yeah.
As we become aware of them, we can start to identify those thoughts, those beliefs that are keeping us stuck.
So awareness is that first step to letting go.
Exactly. Once we can see clearly what's holding us back,
Yeah.
we can start to challenge those negative patterns and choose a different path.
What comes next on this journey up the scale?
Well, the next level is fear.
Fear. Okay.
Fear is a powerful emotion. It can paralyze us, keep us from, taking risks, pursuing our dreams.
Yeah.
Hawkins really suggests that facing our fears head on rather than trying to avoid them is really the key to liberation.
But that can be so scary to face our fears.
Right.
How do we find the courage to do that?
Well, he argues that courage is not something that we're born with. It's a muscle that we can strengthen through practice. Even small acts of courage can have this ripple effect, boosting our self-confidence, paving the way for bigger leaps.
So it's about taking those small steps outside our comfort zone,
Right.
and building that momentum over time.
Exactly. And it's not just about, external risks.
Yeah.
Sometimes courage means, facing those internal demons,
Right.
those limiting beliefs that we hold.
That makes sense. It sounds like, a lot of this journey is about confronting our shadows,
Right.
integrating those darker parts of ourselves.
Yeah. And he talks about the importance of self-empowerment,
Okay.
especially when it comes to overcoming fear.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we have the ability to create the life we want, to take ownership of our choices, our actions.
So it's a shift from feeling helpless to feeling empowered.
Exactly.
Instead of blaming, external circumstances or other people for our problems, we take responsibility.
Right. Yeah.
We recognize our own agency.
And that leads us to the next level on his scale, which is acceptance.
Acceptance. I feel like that word is often misunderstood.
Right.
It's not about just like giving up or resigning ourselves to a bad situation.
You're right. Acceptance is about letting go of resistance, of fighting against what is. It's about acknowledging reality as it is,
Right.
without judgment or blame.
So it's about choosing to see things as they are,
Right.
even if we don't like them,
Right.
and finding peace within that.
Exactly. And from that place of acceptance,
Yeah.
we can then choose how we want to move forward. It doesn't mean we have to condone or agree with everything that happens.
But we acknowledge that we can't control everything.
Right. And surrendering to what is often opens us up to greater peace and understanding.
It sounds like acceptance is really that foundation
Right.
for experiencing true love and peace, within ourselves and in our relationship.
Right. And Hawkins definitely makes that connection.
Yeah.
He argues that when we can accept ourselves fully with all our flaws, our imperfections, we can then extend that same acceptance to others.
That makes sense. If we can't accept ourselves, how can we truly accept others?
Right. And that acceptance really creates a foundation
Yeah.
for deeper, more authentic connections.
It's like we're breaking down those walls that separate us.
Right.
and allowing for that true connection to flow.
And Hawkins even points out that in the state of acceptance,
Hmm.
love is experienced as a stable state, a permanent condition of being.
So it's not that fleeting
Yeah.
in love feeling that's so often, based on need or,
Right.
validation from external sources.
Exactly. It's a much deeper, more grounded sense of love that
Yeah.
really emanates from within.
So as we let go of those blocks, those limitations, our capacity for love actually expands.
That's the idea.
That's awesome. It seems like forgiveness plays a big role in this process of letting go and cultivating love.
Absolutely. Hawkins talks about how, acceptance allows us to forgive both ourselves and others.
Right.
When we can see things from a place of understanding, compassion,
Yeah.
it becomes much easier to let go of resentment, blame.
I think forgiveness is often seen as something we do for the other person,
Right.
but it sounds like it's just as important, if not more important, for ourselves.
It's about freeing ourselves
Right.
from those chains of negativity.
Yeah.
By forgiving, we break those chains and we allow ourselves to really step into a lighter, more joyful way of being.
So acceptance and forgiveness are really these key stepping stones
Right.
on this path to those higher levels of consciousness that Hawkins talks about.
Exactly. And from this foundation of acceptance, we can then start to explore these realms of love, joy, peace,
Okay.
and even enlightenment.
And that's where the real transformation begins.
It is, but I think that's a conversation for the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've gone through this journey on Hawkins' map of consciousness.
Right.
Going from the lower vibrations, the shame and fear and stuff,
Right.
up to those higher realms of acceptance and love. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. Hawkins really emphasizes, this interconnectedness of everything. This idea that, we're not just these isolated individuals, but we're actually part of this vast web of consciousness.
Yeah, it's humbling to think that, our thoughts and feelings can actually have this ripple effect
Right.
beyond just ourselves.
It's humbling, but it's also incredibly empowering
Yeah.
because it means we actually have this power to create positive change, not just in our own lives,
Yeah.
but on a collective level.
So how does that shift happen? Like as we move up that scale of consciousness, like how do we start to see things differently?
Well, Hawkins describes it as this expansion of awareness.
Right.
We begin to see things from this, this much more expansive perspective,
Right.
one that's rooted in, love, compassion, understanding.
Yeah.
And those boundaries between self and other, they really start to dissolve.
So we're moving from like an egocentric view
Yeah.
to a more holistic understanding of reality.
Exactly. And in these higher states of consciousness,
Yep.
there's this really profound sense of oneness with all of life. We experience this deep sense of interconnectedness, belonging,
Yeah.
recognizing our shared humanity.
It's a beautiful, beautiful vision, a world where we treat each other with kindness and respect.
Right.
Does Hawkins actually believe this is something we can achieve?
He argues that it's not just some utopian ideal.
Yeah.
It's an actual reality that we can create
Okay.
by individually and collectively raising those levels of consciousness.
So it starts with each of us, taking responsibility for our own internal state,
Exactly.
choosing to let go of those negative emotions that keep us separate and disconnected.
Right. And consciously cultivating those higher vibrational emotions, the love, the joy, the peace.
Yeah.
And as we do so, we become these beacons of light, radiating positivity outwards
Yeah.
and inspiring others to do the same.
That's like this chain reaction of goodness
I love that.
spreading out into the world.
Yeah. And I know this might sound a little out there to some, but it's important to remember that Hawkins, he backs up these ideas
Yeah.
with scientific evidence.
Right. We talked about his research, muscle testing, the map of consciousness and all that.
Right.
But he also talked about quantum physics.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, he connects his findings to the holographic paradigm and quantum physics,
Yeah.
which both suggest that everything in the universe is interconnected at this fundamental level.
So our thoughts and feelings really do have a tangible impact
Right.
on reality.
Yeah, and here's the most empowering part.
Okay.
You don't have to be a scientist
Yeah.
or a spiritual guru
Yeah.
to experience these higher states of consciousness.
So this is something that's accessible to everyone.
Absolutely. It's about making that conscious choice
Mhm.
to let go of what's holding you back
Yeah.
and step into your full potential.
It's a message that really resonates, this idea that we really do have the power
Right.
to transform our experience
Yeah,
and contribute to a better world.
absolutely. And it's a really hopeful message.
Right.
And I think it really speaks to this universal longing for peace, happiness, connection.
Well, this has been a really enlightening deep dive. I feel very inspired.
Me too.
Um, what are some of your biggest takeaways from all this?
For me, it's just this realization that we have so much more power than
Yeah.
we realize to create the life we want,
Mm.
both for ourselves and for the world.
Yeah.
And that by choosing to let go of that negativity and embrace love,
Right.
we can really transform our experience.
That's a beautiful, beautiful thought. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this journey through David Hawkins' Letting Go.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to explore these ideas further. Remember, the journey doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep letting go. We'll see you next time.